We'll be looking at Hebrews chapter 11 tonight. If you aren't there in your Bibles, you can be turning over there. Or not. Hebrews chapter 11. And got two more lessons tonight and then one more lesson in the book of Hebrews. And then the curriculum shifts a little bit to the life of Jesus. So we're actually going to start, I guess, in 2 weeks on the Beatitudes. And I'd say as fast as this stuff will probably eclipse Dennis in a week or two. He's going through Matthew right now on Sunday mornings. But we are going to start there just because that's what the curriculum tells us to do. So I guess the good news is we won't be there long. Hebrews chapter 11. So first two questions deal with some of the things that we're going to discuss tonight. And if you remember, not too long ago, I guess it's been a while, but we did an entire series on sermons on Hebrews 11 and part of chapter 12. So I trust probably most of us are familiar with a lot of the information that's found there. Certainly a lot of main Bible characters that are mentioned there, and a lot of common stories that we probably read and studied and memorized since we were kids. So not a lot of new information in those regards, so hopefully we won't have to read all of it to kind of take it all in. But question number one says, if you were able to listen to your own funeral eulogy, how would you like to hear yourself described? What are some things you would hope to hear at your own funeral?
He was unable to make it.
Well, I guess... I guess that'd be true. I don't know that I'd hope to hear that, but he was honest. Okay. Yeah, that's a good one. Faithful. Yeah, that's something I hope can be said whenever I depart from this life. What else? Anything else that you would want?
I always like the characteristic meek.
Meek? Yeah, that's a good one. Humble or meek? Yeah, the reality of it is, you know, even when we depart from this life, do people stop talking about us? No, and that's one of the things I think that we get from Hebrews chapter 11. You know, we're talking about men and women in this chapter that lived thousands upon thousands of years ago upon this earth. And of course, you know, one of them that comes to mind, one of the first one that's mentioned there, or the first one that's mentioned there, is Abel. You know, what do we say about Abel whenever we talk about him? Yeah, his faith. We talk about the great faith that he had. We talk about the sacrifices, the acceptable sacrifices that he made to God. And I think it'd be safe to say that all of us, whatever is said about us, we'd want it to be good. Right? I don't think there's anybody here tonight that wants something bad said about them. Am I wrong? Okay, I didn't think so. But we'd want good things and true things said about our lives. But the reality of it is people are still going to talk about our lives even after we're gone. So that's something to think about tonight as we go through these great men and women of faith. What are people going to say about us, you know, after we've departed from this life? What is going to be their memory about us? And then question number 2 deals with the idea of faith or trust, because that's really the theme of Hebrews 11. The Hebrew writer is showing them the better way of living. The way that God has always been acceptable, God has been a way of faith. But it says, when you were a child, what are some ways you showed trust or faith in your parents? Everybody trusts their parents? I think probably everybody here tonight did. What are some ways we showed our trust in them? Okay, yeah, that's one of the things. Whenever they told us to do something, you know, if you were a child and you did what they said without any hesitation, and that showed that you trusted them, didn't it? It showed that you had faith in them. What else?
Trust that they take care of us. If we're hurt or scared or anything, we'd run to.
Yeah, you know,
person that would take care of us.
Right, and I was kind of thinking about when I was writing some of these down. You know, as a child, I don't ever remember really having any worries. Did you? I mean, did you worry about whether you're going to have something to eat or somewhere to live, or like Daryl said, if you got hurt, you know, if mom and dad is going to be there to take care of you? I think we all just trusted that, you know, they were going to be there whenever we need them, and they were going to provide for us. And so, not worrying about things in life demonstrated the trust that we had in them. Anything else? We've got one other thing here, and that is we accepted whatever they told us. We took them at their word. So, you know, if mom or dad told you something, that's just the way it was. Didn't matter what anybody else said or what anybody else thought. You trusted and believed that what mom and dad said was true. So there's a number of ways that we display trust or faith in our parents as children. And you know, as children of God today, those same qualities, those are the ways that we display our faith in God. You know, taking God at His word, trusting what He says, no matter what else may happen or what else somebody might say. Not worrying about what we're going to eat, what we're going to drink, you know, what are we going to wear. It shows our faith or our trust in God. Whenever God tells us to do something, obeying without hesitating. You know, trusting that whatever He tells us to do is going to be good for us and right for us. And you see all those characteristics of these great men and women of faith here in Hebrews chapter 11. So let's go to verse 1 here, and somebody read verse 1 for us, and then we'll talk about the question number 3 here. What is faith? Okay, so if you were to describe faith, how would you describe it? Let's just use the definition or the description, however you want to label it here in verse 1. What are some key words that pop out to you?
Hope.
Okay, hope, yeah. Faith is the substance of the things that we hope for. That word substance, it's an interesting word. It means literally to stand upon or to support. And so what the Bible is telling us is faith is what supports, what holds up the things that we hope for. And I think I pointed out when we went through this chapter, I don't think verse 1 is necessarily a definition of faith, but it is a description of what faith does for us. And so faith supports the things that we hope for. It's our trust in God, right? Trusting what He says, trusting that what He promised will come true. That's what supports or holds up the hope that we have for the future. So faith is, to kind of put it in modern day illustration, faith is what a foundation is to a house. That's what faith is for a Christian. It's what upholds it. It's what supports it. It's what gives strength to it. And so you have the idea of faith being the substance of the things that are hoped for. And then he makes the statement in the second part of that verse, the evidence of things that are not seen. And of course, the word evidence, it literally means a conviction. You know, the idea of an assurance or a conviction of the things that we cannot see, that they're really there. So what does faith do for a Christian? Faith gives the assurance or the conviction to the Christian that the things we cannot see with our eye are true. They're, in reality, they exist. So it allows us to believe in the reality of things that are unseen, we might say. Anybody want to add anything to that? No? Guys, I think everybody's awake so far.
I've never been to California. I've never seen California. But I've seen it on a map. Just like this being God's Word, I can see God's Word in it right here.
Yeah.
That provides a little bit of faith for me.
Yeah, and you know, I know we've been over the definition of faith before, but by definition, the description or the definition of faith involves the idea of not being able to see something with the eye. Believing in something that you cannot see. If you can see it with your eye, if you can touch it, taste it, and smell it, and you know, interact with it, you don't need faith to believe it. But faith is believing in that which you cannot see, the reality of the unseen. And so that's kind of the bottom line definition of we're trusting in the things that God has told us is there, but we cannot see it with the human eye. It doesn't mean, one of the things I think that sometimes people get confused on when it comes to faith, it doesn't mean that there's no evidence to support You know, that to believe in something that there's no evidence to support, that's superstition. That's not faith. The evidence for the existence of God is there. You know, can we see God with a human eye? Well, no, but that doesn't mean there's no evidence to support the existence of God. And so it's not that you believe in something because there's no evidence. It's just that you believe in something even though you can't see it with your own eye. And the evidence points to the reality of the fact that it is there. So question number 4 here. What does faith help us to comprehend about the creation of the world? Somebody read verse 3 here in Hebrews 11.
By faith we understand the worlds were prepared by the word of God, so that what is seen was not made out of things which are visible.
Okay, so what does faith help us comprehend about this created world?
God spoke it into existence.
Yeah, God made it, right? And of course, the idea of understanding there, it literally means to perceive something within the mind. You know, it's this idea to come to know or to come to understand a fact. And so faith allows us, even though we didn't see God do it, faith is believing in God created this world. We didn't see it with our own eyes. Is the evidence there? Okay, how do we know that? How do we know that God exists and that God created this world?
By faith.
It is by faith, yeah. It's not something that we've seen. But what's the evidence to support it? We just talked about the idea, it's not that there's a lack of evidence.
That's the saying, we've heard it 100 times, but when you come up and see a house sitting there, you know somebody built the house. Look at the seasons and the plant life cycle, the trees, the grass, how we need one to survive, the trees need us to survive. It's all a big cycle. There's no way this happened by accident. It's too complicated.
Yeah, and so we know the evidence point to the idea of a higher being than us, right? That's what Paul's emphasizing there, and back in Hebrews 3 and verse 4, like Adam made or referenced there, the Hebrew writer said that every house is built by some man, but he that built all things is God. So when we pass by a house today, we look at that house and we know common sense, right? It's just a fact. Somebody built that house. It didn't build itself. And so when we go through the universe today, like Adam said, and you look at the design and the complexity and the way that things function, has anybody here ever built a tree? Anybody here do that?
Killed one.
So if you need a tree killed, see Wes.
Trying to keep them alive.
Yeah.
And that, to me, that's a big evidence. The stuff that is so delicate. And they say, well, it goes from this to that. And I can't even plant a tree in the yard half the time it's dead.
Yeah.
And speaking of trees, there's a big tree called a live oak. Is it a live oak? They got limbs on them as big as your body, and they're huge. Try to stick one of them on there and get it to stay on there yourself.
Yeah.
Man can't do that.
Yeah, it's just a fact. When you go through life, you just look at certain things. You say, "Man, somebody built that." You know it. And what we know when we look around us is somebody had to build it. There's no way it was an accident, right? No way it happened by itself. Couldn't build itself. And what do we know? Like when we look at a tree, what do we know by looking at it? Well, here's what Paul says over in Romans 1 and verse 19. I think this is what Dennis was trying to think of, and he was trying to get me to think of it Sunday morning. I couldn't think of it either. But Romans 1 and verse 19, he says, "Because what may be known of God is manifest in them, for God has shown it to them. For since the creation of the world, his invisible attributes are clearly seen, being understood by the things that are made, even his eternal power and Godhead, so that they are without excuse." And so what Paul was talking about with the Gentile world is when you walk around and you look at the things that are made, the things that you can see, you know that somebody invisible made them. Because we can't make them, right? We can't make trees. We can't make oceans or seas or skies. We know that whoever made them is more powerful than we are. And so he's talking about the divinity and the divine attributes and the power of God. We know that just from observation. And so even though we didn't see God make the world by speaking it into existence, we know that he did. And it's through faith, it's through belief in the unseen, based on, again, all this evidence that we have. Just the reality is we haven't seen it with our own eye. Doesn't mean there's no evidence to support it. But we believe, faith allows us to believe that God created this earth by speaking it into existence. And so we get into some of the great characters that are found here in this chapter. Somebody read verse 4 here, and we'll talk about how Abel demonstrated his faith.
By faith Abel offered unto God a more excellent sacrifice than Cain, by which he obtained witness that he was righteous, God testifying of his gifts, and by it he being dead yet speaking.
Okay, so how did Abel demonstrate his faith?
He obeyed.
Yeah, and specifically what? What realm was his obedience in? Worship, right, or offering the correct sacrifice. And so how do we know that Abel believed God? Yeah, he obeyed, right? He did what God told him to do. You know, I reference, when we look at this, we read about all these great men and women of faith or great men and women of the Bible who did something through faith. You know, it's by faith they did this. Through faith they did this. And I always like to reference Romans 10:17. Faith comes by hearing. Hearing comes by the word of God. And so what it means when they say that they did it through faith is they listened to what God said. And they trusted it. And because they trusted him, they obeyed. And so why did Abel offer what he offered? Did it by faith. It's because God told him to, right? How do we know that Cain didn't believe? Cain didn't have faith.
God was not pleased with his sacrifice.
Okay? The outcome was God was not pleased with the sacrifice, and why was that the case? Yeah, he didn't do what God said. If you're going to do something by faith, you have to listen to what God says and then follow it. Cain didn't do that. Abel did. And so that's why Abel's sacrifice was accepted. That's why Cain's was not. Probably had to do, I don't want to chase too many rabbits here, but probably had to do with the idea of a blood sacrifice for sin. You know, the Bible tells us without the shedding of blood, there's no remission of sin. A person want to have their sins forgiven, had to shed blood. Cain says, I don't think that's the case. I'm just going to offer this and God will forgive my sin. Didn't work, did it? Did for Abel, though. So let's read about Enoch here in verse 5. Somebody read verse 5 for us.
By faith Enoch was translated that he should not see death, and was not found, because God had translated him, and before his translation he had this testimony that he pleased God.
Okay, so what was unusual about Enoch and some of the things that happened to him? There's more than one thing, I think, really. But what's something that stands out to you?
Isn't he the one that said walk with God?
Yeah. Yeah, he was a man who pleased God, and we kind of deduce because of, you know, what happens in the next chapter, the destruction of the entire earth, and because of what God did for him, we kind of deduce that was pretty rare in that day and age. You know, Enoch did what God said. He was so pleased with Enoch. And can you imagine a righteous man here living like God said in the midst of a wicked world? But Enoch was a man who walked with God. He pleased God by his faith. And so what was unique?
He died.
Yeah, God took him. He didn't die. You know, normally when a person leaves this earth and enters into the presence of God, how do we do it? Through death, right? Can't do it any other way, can we? What was unique about Enoch is he didn't have to do that. God just took him. And so he didn't have to experience the act of physical death, but God just translated him, literally carried him across from heaven, or from earth into heaven. And so that was a unique privilege that he had, but the reason that he did, that he got to do that is why? His faith was it. It was his trust, his belief in the things that God had told him that he hadn't seen with his own eye that made him pleasing to God. Of course, we read about another man like that in the scripture. What other man can you think of who didn't see death? Yeah, Elijah. You remember after Elijah was taken up in the fiery chariot, or the chariot in the fiery whirlwind into heaven, remember the sons of the prophets came back to Elisha and they said, we're going to go look for his body. They said, it's probably laying out here on one of these mountains. God picked him up and then he threw his body out here somewhere. Did they find his body? Now, Elisha told them before, he said, don't go because you're not going to find it. They looked for 3 days, they never found it. Well, it wasn't there. God took him directly into heaven. And so, two individuals that we read about in the Bible that experienced that unique thing in life, and of course about Enoch here, we read about him. He got to do it because of his faith. So the question becomes, question 7 here, what role does faith play in approaching and pleasing God? What does Hebrews 11:6 say? Yeah, without faith it is impossible to please God. So there's no way that we can please God without trusting, right? So if we don't trust God that when he tells us something, that's the way it is, even though we can't see it with our own eyes, there's no way that we can be pleasing to him without that trust or faith. There's two things that are really emphasized in that verse that we have to believe. What are they?
He is, and he's a rewarder.
Yeah, number one, that God does exist. I mean, we have to believe that, don't we? If we don't believe that, can we please God? I mean, how could you please God if you don't even believe he exists? You know, some people say, well, I'm not sure if he exists. Is that good enough? Does that go please God? That's not faith, is it? It's not believing in the unseen, trusting in the unseen. The second thing was what?
He rewards those diligently seek him.
Yeah, he's a rewarder of those who diligently seek after him. And so it's not that God, rewards the sleepy-eyed Christian, right? That's not what the Bible teaches us. Or the complacent, the half-interested, the worldly-minded, the pleasure seeker. Those aren't the people who God rewards. He rewards those who diligently seek after him. And so if we don't believe that we'll be rewarded when we diligently seek after God, can we be pleasing to him? No. I think that's a good lesson for us as Christians. Sometimes...
I'm sorry. That's why we should believe that heaven is ours.
Yes.
That, it exists. And that we're going to get to heaven. And because I hear a lot of people sometimes say, oh, well, I hope I make it to heaven. You should know that you're going to make it to heaven if you're really going to please God, if you're faithful and diligently serving.
Yeah, and that's a good point. If we don't believe that we're going to go to heaven, I mean, do you think God's pleased with the lack of faith in that department? I mean, it's impossible to please God if we don't believe that he's going to reward those who diligently seek him. Now, if we're being complacent and half-hearted, that's something we need to look at and examine. But hey, if we're living like God told us to live, don't doubt it. We're going. I mean, it's there. That's what you read about these great men and women of faith here in this chapter. That was their conviction, wasn't it? I mean, Abraham, he was going to heaven. So that's what we need to have too, that same kind of faith. Question number 8 here. What did Noah's faith prompt him to do?
Build a boat.
Yeah, build a boat. A little tiny canoe, right? No, a giant boat. Yeah, an ark. You think about Noah, and again, you go back to Genesis 6. I know we don't have time to go and read all the background of these people, these men and women that are mentioned here, but remember that every thought of the imagination of man's heart was only evil continually, the Bible tells us. And God was sorry, made God sorry that he had even created man. You know, he'd reached such a corrupt and wicked and evil state. God said, man, why did I do this? And then you have in verse 8, this exception there in Genesis 6, but Noah found grace in the eyes of the Lord. So you have again this idea, this righteous man in the midst of all this corruption. It was so bad that God knew man was never going to change. There was no bringing them back from the state that they were in. And the only way that he could remedy what was happening is to basically start over with one family. And so that's what he did. He determined that he was going to destroy the entire earth with water by a flood. And when you think about Noah, God told Noah to do something that required a lot of faith, didn't he? Why did it take so much faith for Noah to build an ark?
I think one, it never rained, is my opinion, up until this point. And two, if my memory serves me, I want to say the Bible reads like it took him 120 years or something to build this boat and preach to everybody while he's doing it, trying to get them to turn from their sins.
Yeah.
So nobody's ever seen rain. He's telling these people this is coming, and he's building a monster boat. They all think he's crazy. And he kept it up for 120 years.
Yeah, that would take a lot of faith, wouldn't it? And again, it wasn't like he had, like we do today, hundreds of people to hold his hand and go out there and support him. I mean, he was on his own. Everybody else was probably laughing all day long at the things that were going on. But Noah had so much reverence and so much respect and awe and trust in God that he did exactly what God told him to do. Even though he'd never seen these things with his own eye. He'd probably never seen rain, like Adam said. That's kind of the biblical indication. I know he'd never seen a universal flood. Nobody had ever seen a flood that covered the entire earth and destroyed all the plants and the animals and the people on it. But he believed it was coming because God said it was. And so he had faith, trust, and belief in God. And because of that, he built that giant boat. And he and his family were saved, while the rest of the earth perished. What about Abraham's life? Question 9 here. How did faith affect Abraham, the way he lived? What were some of the things that faith made him do? Do what?
Offer up his son.
Yeah, that's really probably the major thing that we think about. He, of course, left his homeland, didn't he, to start out with. He even left, God gave him 3 great promises. He said, if you leave your home and go where I tell you to go, I'll give you 3 things. And what were those 3 things? Kind of review here.
He'll give him a homeland. He'll give him a great nation.
Okay. What was the 3rd one?
Through his seed, all the people would be blessed.
Yeah. So he made 3 great promises to Abraham. He says, if you leave your homeland and go where I tell you to go, here's what I'll do for you. Did Abraham believe God? Yeah. Packed up his stuff with his family, left his country, left his homeland. Did he know where he's going? Can you imagine that? Setting out on the journey and where are we going? I don't know. We know when we'll get there because God will tell us though, right? But it was just this attitude of trust in God. No, you'll be okay. Everything will work out. God, we can trust God. He'll get us where we need to go. And so it was his great faith that caused him to do those things. Like Dennis mentioned there, question 11, the ultimate test I think that God put Abraham through was the sacrifice of Isaac. And why was that such a great test of faith? I mean, first of all, it's a sacrifice of your own child. I mean, that, I've said before, I don't know how anybody could, ever bring themselves to where you're good with it in your own mind, I guess. But take into account, how many children did he have? Yeah, he had 2 technically, right? But only really one that was going to count for everything. And that's why the sacrificing of Isaac was such a test of faith, because what was Isaac to Abraham?
It was his legacy.
He was the promises of God, right? God had promised him all these great things. And this was the one through whom all these great things were going to be fulfilled. And so now God says, go put him to death. And what did Abraham believe?
He thought he was going to bring him right back to the dead.
Yeah, he had so much trust in God. He said, well, God's just going to resurrect him from the dead and we're going to go on. He's going to fulfill these promises to us. But again, it was, his faith affected the way that he lived. And certainly our faith should do that today. Moses, he made some hard choices because of his faith. What did he choose? He had two choices. What were those two choices?
Well, you could say there as an Egyptian and Pharaoh, almost.
Yeah, so he had a choice to either live a pleasurable life or to suffer. That was his two choices. Which one did you choose? Why did he choose to suffer?
He loved his people and God.
Yeah, it was his trust in God that after this, there's something greater than this life. Right? There's a greater reward to experience than the living that we can experience here upon this earth. And so because Moses believed that, that's what God told him, because he believed that, he chose to suffer. Chose to suffer while living here upon this earth. And you read about the rest of the chapter, there were just numerous amounts of men and women too. I think only one woman that's mentioned here in this chapter, but there were a lot of women of faith there too, who did amazing things simply because they believed and trusted in God. And that's what it takes to be pleasing to God. Now I want you to think about, as we're winding up here, the context of this book, because remember that Paul's writing here to people who had obeyed the gospel, but now they're going back to the law of Moses. And he's encouraging them to put their faith in God in this new system. Trust in God, trust that the sacrifices that he's given you are going to be good, they're going to work. Trust that Jesus is the best high priest that a person can have. That's what it takes to be pleasing to God. These great men and women, that was how they pleased God, and that's the way that you guys are going to please God too. So, anybody have any thoughts or comments there? I know we didn't do that chapter justice, but yes, sir.
You sure Paul wrote Hebrew?
Well, I'm about 99.99% sure.
He believes that.
Yeah, I always say I can almost prove it. Anybody else? Yes, sir.
As far as earlier you had talked about how we know that we were created. We weren't a little sludge of that. We are the only one on the planet that has a soul. And you think about survival, it's still, we are really furry, we don't have no claws, yet somehow we are here and not animals that we was.
Yeah.
And that seems really significant.
Yeah.
Because other animals learn, but they don't have consciousness.
Right. Yeah, God made us unique, didn't he? Different from everything else, for sure.